Okay, welcome to Commsverse. This session is called Video Interop with Microsoft Teams, and today will be presented to you by Damien Margaritis. Over to you, Damien.
Thanks very much, Peter. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another Commsverse session. My name is Damien Margaritis, and today I'm taking you through Video Interop with Microsoft Teams. First up, we do want to thank all of our amazing sponsors. Without these sponsors, this type of event couldn't go ahead. So do make sure to check them out. A lot of these are in the showcase, the virtual showcase that's happening as well. So get amongst it. So as I mentioned before, my name is Damien Margaritis, sometimes known as DMUnified. You can find me at my email address there. I've got a blog listed, LinkedIn, Twitter. And if you do happen to be in Australia, I do run 2 meetups, one for Brisbane and one for Melbourne. They are, of course, virtual these days, given the current COVID situation, so you are able to join these from anywhere in the world. Okay, let's get started. So before we get into Video Interop from Microsoft Teams, I wanted to start with a little bit of history, I guess. So way back in 2008, when I was deploying systems, this is pre-Link, pre-Sky for Business, all of that. This was what I was deploying. It was pretty separate solutions. There's a VoIP system on the left there, and on the right there we've got back then a Tandberg video conferencing system. But what I wanted to point out here is that back then it was pretty common to deploy a SIP platform, and then for video conferencing a H223 platform in the meeting rooms. And these worlds were pretty separate. We didn't really have much crossover between them. So all of these devices that we were deploying into meeting rooms at the time, they were what we call standards-based SIP or H223 endpoints. So you'd be familiar with Cisco endpoints potentially, Polycom, which is now Poly, of course, and even right up to the telepresence immersive suites that you see there in the bottom right here, that all used a flavor of SIP or H223 that was considered standards-based. And what do we mean by that? So the term standards-based refers to any video conferencing endpoint that uses either SIP or H223 protocol to communicate with other endpoints using SIP or H223. They don't necessarily have to be from the same manufacturer for that to work either. So it was quite common in some scenarios to have a Polycom endpoint talking to a Cisco endpoint that would actually work and would be able to communicate between those two devices, audio, video, application sharing, those types of things. But of course, moving forward and around 2009, 2010, it was really when Link 2010 took off that I really started to get involved in deploying Microsoft Unified Communications solutions. So at this point, we had a Microsoft SIP environment. So we had Link servers, Link users joining from a web browser. And on the other side, we still quite often had H223 endpoints in our meeting rooms. So whether it be Polycom or Cisco or whatnot, we had H223 devices. So we're in a situation where we still essentially have SIP on one side and H223 on the other. And what we did back then is we would deploy some type of infrastructure, some gateway infrastructure in between that would allow those two worlds to talk to each other. So if we wanted to have a Polycom endpoint, for example, or a Cisco endpoint join a Link meeting, they could, and same vice versa. If I wanted a Link user to join into a meeting that was hosted on infrastructure sitting over here on H223, I could do that as well. And the types of partners that you'd probably be familiar with, the Polycoms, the PECSIPs, the Acanos, which later was purchased by Cisco, they're the type of interop solutions that we would use to sit between these two worlds. And this is how we would kind of get interop back when it was a Link 2010 deployment, through to Link 2013, and of course, even through to Sky for Business server deployments. It was really common to deploy this type of infrastructure. Looking at one specific example here, so this is Polycom's on-premises solution at the time. This was a RealConnect platform, and you'll see here that we still have this concept of standards-based video conferencing endpoints on the left and Sky for Business endpoints on the right. And we had this concept of cascading between the two worlds. So it was pretty common, again, for us to have Sky for Business, Link, etc. on one side, our Polycom infrastructure on the other side with Polycom room systems like Polycom HDX and Polycom Group. And that would communicate or cascade audio, video, content sharing between each other. And this is how we handled getting interop between SIP and H223 in the Microsoft world. Okay. What it looked like for an end user was I would have the normal join link meeting, as you can see here, or join Skype meeting invite, and then we were able to place some additional text in the bottom of the invite. So someone joining from a standards-based endpoint could dial this string and get into my Microsoft meeting. Similarly, internal HTTP endpoints could also join Link or Skype Business Server meetings using this method. Although more commonly, we would have something called OneTouchStyle to push a button to those endpoints. We're going to cover that in a little bit after this session. So moving forward to 2017, this is when we started to see some cloud-based solutions from organizations like Polycom that allowed us to interop between these two worlds. So the first one back in 2017 was RealConnect for Office 365. And this was built to allow Skype for Business, to allow standards-based endpoints to join Skype for Business meetings. So non-native standards-based video conferencing endpoints to join Skype for Business online meetings. And this was all deployed in Azure that was managed by Polycom. How this would work is we would have a license that was applied to a user, and when that license was switched on, very similar to what I showed you earlier, some additional text would appear in the meeting invite. Someone could go to that link, enter the code, and get into my Skype for Business meeting. So this is what we had in 2017, just a little bit before Teams came onto the scene. So this solved two key scenarios for us. If we wanted to move to Skype for Business Online and had investment in standards-based endpoints down here, we could use this RealConnect for Office 365 for Skype for Business, so that those endpoints could still get into my Skype for Business Online meetings. The other thing it also solved was if I didn't have any standards-based endpoints, if I was using either just standard Skype for Business users inside my organization, or I was using things like link room systems inside my organization, this could still be useful to deploy in that I still want external video conferencing systems to be able to get into my Skype for Business Online meetings. So even if I didn't have Polycom Group or Cisco endpoints or anything else inside my organization, and I didn't really care about making sure internal endpoints could join my Skype for Business Online meetings, there was still a benefit to having this solution in place. But then, of course, 2017, we see Teams come onto the scene. Brand new architecture, not based on SIP, not based on HTTP3. So how do we handle interop? So just to really reiterate that. So before Teams came along, and you could argue this as well for things like Zoom and Webex and other platforms, we essentially had two worlds that we wanted to get interop between. We usually had a flavor of SIP on one side and HTTP3 on the other. So again, what I was talking about earlier, we had Skype for Business SIP on one side and HTTP3 on the other, and the interop happened between those two worlds. Moving forward to today, Microsoft Teams is not based on SIP or HTTP3. Sure, there's elements of SIP in Teams if you're talking about direct routing and other technologies that Teams can use. But under the hood, it is not a SIP or a HTTP3 client. It's not a SIP or HTTP3 endpoint. Similarly, this goes for any of the other partners out there as well. So if you look at Zoom, for example, to do video conferencing, it's not based on SIP or HTTP3 per se. They might have some interop capabilities with those platforms. But now we're in a world where you're having technologies built in the web, cloud first, that aren't based on either of these two existing legacy protocols. So how do we handle interop? And if we bring that back to Teams, how do we handle interop with Microsoft Teams today? So the first question that's worth asking is, do I even need interop? What's the out-of-box experience like with Microsoft Teams? So before delving into the interop options, let's have a look at some of the use cases that an organization might have. So for example, if your organization only schedules meetings for internal staff only, has no meetings with externals whatsoever. Pretty unlikely. I don't see much of that in my experience, but let's say that's a scenario. Well, let's say the organization controls the scheduling of meetings always, and externals are joining and they're able to join via the Teams meeting web app, or they're able to dial a phone number. So here what I'm showing on the screen, with the exception of the logo and the text underneath it, this is what a standard Microsoft Teams meeting invite looks like when you have the audio conferencing license as well. So if you don't have the audio conferencing license, you'll always have to join Microsoft Teams meeting hyperlink when you create a new Teams online meeting. that someone can click on and they can join from external, okay? The phone number is optional. That is there if you have the audio conferencing license associated with your users. And of course, the phone number is configurable. I'm in Melbourne, Australia. I have a Melbourne, Australia phone number. But if I click on local numbers, people can actually find a number from over 90 countries around the world to get into my meeting. So at that point, that might be enough for what I need, right? I control the meeting invite. I send out the meeting invite and people join from the web. And I'm using native devices in my room. So if I'm using Surface Hub or Microsoft Teams room systems, or more recently, the collaboration bars from Yealink and Polycom, or Poly, I should say, that are now certified for Microsoft Teams, if I've got native devices throughout my organization, I may not need any interop, okay? I don't have any standards-based devices within my organization, be it Cisco or something else, that I need to sweat the investment on or something like that. So if I've got all native devices, I may not need any interop at all. One other thing to point out that you may or may not know is that I can set up native Teams meeting join between organizations. So let's say I'm an organization that communicates with other organizations on a regular basis, and they're all using Teams as well. In this example, what you can see on the screen here, this is an example of a Microsoft Teams room system panel, and this top meeting is my very own meeting. I've sent that to my meeting device from my own tenant, Office 365 tenant. This second one below, Adele is actually from a completely different organization, and I've allowed Adele to send a meeting invite directly to my Microsoft Teams room system panel, direct to MTR. So without any type of interop, Adele is able to send a meeting from a different tenant. I can hit join and join Adele's meeting. This one at the bottom, slightly different use case, but one that's probably more common. Adele actually sent the meeting invite to me at my email address, and I've actually forwarded it to the Microsoft Teams room, ready to have that meeting with Adele. So I can do all that out of the box, as long as I've set a couple of configuration elements on the mailbox. So a couple of things that need to be configured on the resource mailbox for that to work: process external meeting messages true, delete comments false. Okay, you want those to be set, and then you can actually support that use case. So quite handy. All right, let's say that that isn't enough. Let's say that I do actually need some more interop than what, or more capability than what I can get natively out of the box with Microsoft Teams. So Microsoft have introduced this thing called Cloud Video Interop. And in a nutshell, Cloud Video Interop is a cloud-based Microsoft qualified solution that enables standards-based meeting room devices to join Microsoft Teams meetings. So again, if we look at those devices that we were talking about before, say from Polycom or Cisco or Lifesize, these are not native Microsoft Teams meeting endpoints, but I might want them to get into my meeting. Cloud Video Interop supports this scenario, okay? And this is how it looks. So we have our standards-based SIP or H323 video conferencing endpoint over here. And over the other side, we have our Microsoft Teams environment that exists in our Office 365 tenant. The next component here, this Teams Interop bot that lives in Azure. This is actually something that Microsoft developed, the Communication Services SDK, and they've given it to certified partners to use, okay? Those partners build some of their additional capabilities around it, so they're able to kind of add their own IP, their own ways of doing things, and they can wrap it into a service. And then that is supporting interop between those two worlds. And down the bottom here, we've got Poly, BlueJeans, and PexIP as the three that are offering the service today. Cisco has recently been added to that list as well. So I do need to update this slide. But in a nutshell, this interop service always lives in Azure. It must live in Azure. The partners, there were some models where PexIP had on-premises MCUs and whatnot that can interface with this bot. The rest, however, Poly and BlueJeans, it's a fully cloud-based solution. And PexIP, I should add, also have a fully cloud-based solution for this today as well. So I don't need any on-prem infrastructure. This all lives in Azure, and I'm able to support those endpoints coming into my Microsoft Teams meetings. And what do the invites look like? So here's an example of a Polycom or Poly invite here, and this is a BlueJeans one over here. But you can see it's pretty much the same. Okay, so they have access to this service. They're able to interface with Office 365, your Office 365 tenant the same way. And when you license someone or you enable someone to use this service, this is the text that appears in the meeting invite. So now I don't just have a hyperlink and a phone number to get into a meeting. I also have this additional capability below. Okay. And what I like about this is now when I'm sending out meeting invites for my Microsoft Teams meetings, I've essentially given people every single method to get into my meeting. Okay. They can click a hyperlink and come in via a web browser or come in via their own Teams client. They can dial a phone number or alternatively click on local numbers and find a number that's closer to them in the world. Or alternatively, they can walk into their meeting room that has a H323 endpoint, let's say a Cisco room. They can dial this string, enter an ID, and they too can get into my Microsoft Teams meeting with full audio, video, and application sharing. Okay. So even if I don't want to support it from my own internal endpoints, there's still some use here. There's still something that's really useful. Okay. It still allows externals to get into my meeting, even if they are not a a native Teams endpoint. Here's an example. If I go back at one slide, you'll see that there's also an alternate VTC dialing instructions link that's on both of these meeting invites. Here's an example of what you see when you click on those. So if the person at the other end isn't sure what they're supposed to dial, this gives some examples. So on the left is Poly, on the right is BlueJeans. We have, if it's a Cisco endpoint, dial this way. If it's life size, dial this way. A whole bunch of different things that they can try. Okay, so it's designed to make it just a little bit simpler for them to dial and get into your meeting. So the end user experience, Real Connect for Teams solves two key scenarios. Scenario one, I've got my own non-Teams native endpoints that I need to hop through Cloud Video Interop to get into my Microsoft Teams meetings. My native Microsoft Teams rooms and my native Microsoft Teams users don't have to go through this service. They go direct to Teams. Okay? It's only the Cloud Video Interop service that these endpoints have to go through because they do not talk or speak native Teams, right? They have to be proxied via Cloud Video Interop, and we've got a number of providers that provide that. The other scenario is externals coming in. So that's those externals, again, non-Teams native endpoints, Cisco, Lifesize, Polycom, for example, can come in via Cloud Video Interop and get into my Microsoft Teams meeting. So one service, one set of licensing supports all of this. I should point out as well from a licensing perspective that it is based on a concurrency model. So back in the Real Connect for Sky for Business days, I would have to purchase a license per user, assign that to the license in the licensing portal, in the Office 365 licensing portal, and then they would get the text that would appear in their meeting invite. It just didn't scale very well. It's hard to license. What if we just want a concurrency model? So moving forward into Real Connect for Teams or the same similar offerings with Cloud Video Interop from BlueJeans, PEX IP and Cisco, it is licensed on a concurrency model. So I can purchase, for example, 10 Interop licenses, which allows me to have up to 10 standards-based endpoints getting into any of my Microsoft Teams meetings. And then I control with policy which people or which accounts get the additional text that appears in the meeting invite. So I might have 10 concurrent ports that I've paid for, licenses, but 100 people might have the text in the bottom of their meeting invite that allows standards-based endpoints to join Microsoft Teams meetings. So today they have separated the logic, made it easier basically, right? That makes a lot of sense. Okay. So we've talked about Cloud Video Interop and how that helps us get our standards-based meeting room endpoints into a Microsoft Teams meeting. And we saw how people do that by entering the text that's at the bottom of the meeting invite on their Cisco endpoint, it's a company X, and they get into my Microsoft Teams meeting. But that's not such a useful workflow for my own users in my own offices, right? I don't want them to have to walk into a room, open the laptop, dial a code to get into their own Microsoft Teams meeting. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So we have this thing called OneTouchStyle. Okay, so Cloud Video Interop added additional information to the Teams meeting invite, which can be dialed from any standards-based endpoint to join a Teams meeting, as I just mentioned. Endpoint with user, but we don't want our own internal users having to manually dial from a non-Teams native endpoint within that organization. So OneTouchStyle solves this problem for us. And how it does this, and I'll add as well that this example that I'm giving you is Poly's service. This is OneTouchStyle with Poly. There are other flavors of this from PexIP and others that can do a very similar thing. Okay, this example was based on Poly because this is the one that I just happen to have access to. So basically what happens is those video conferencing endpoints, whether it's Cisco or Polycom, they communicate with Exchange to get that meeting invite, to get those details of that meeting. So when I send a meeting invite to a room, the Polycom endpoint reads it, and if it understands the meeting invite, it will actually put a button on the screen, a one button click to join, as we call it, in order to join the meeting. Now, for all those people out there that have Polycom group series that natively registered to Sky for Business, you would be familiar with this. Polycom group registered to Sky for Business. I go into Outlook, I go new Skype meeting, I invite the room and I send it, and the room automatically gets a button on the screen. And it's able to do that because the group system understands the Skype meeting invite and it knows what to do with it. If I do exactly the same thing with a Microsoft Teams meeting invite, the endpoint doesn't know what to do with it, okay? One sec there. Please hold. I just had a notification that there might have been a screen glitch. I just want to make sure that everybody is still okay and can still see my screen. 1 second. At this point, I will continue. Or if I hear from the producer, I will come back to this. Okay. Okay, so back to OneTouchStyle. So what OneTouchStyle does is it sits between Exchange and my endpoints that live in my within my organization, and it's able to read those meeting invites as they come through. And if it's a meeting invite for something that the endpoint won't understand, it'll actually rewrite the invite and sending. Let me just, I just noticed that it's got some problems with sharing. I'm just going to re-share my screen with Peter. Give me 1 sec. And I'll wait to see if that resolves our problems. Won't be a second. Okay, I think we're good to go. I shall continue. Okay, so OneTouchStyle sits between Exchange and your endpoints. And we notice here that we've got this cloud relay here that's in place for Cisco endpoints. So Cisco endpoints won't kind of automatically poll to get new meeting info, they kind of pull it, right? So in order to support this being a cloud-based service and sitting outside the firewall, we have a cloud relay server that exists in Cisco standards-based environments, where it's able to pull the details from OneTouchStyle and then shoot that across to the Cisco endpoints, okay? So the key takeaway here is when I want to use OneTouchStyle, the only change on the endpoints is I change where the calendaring service is pointing to. So in the example of Polycom, instead of pointing direct to Exchange now for my calendaring service, I actually point to OneTouchStyle, which is configured to integrate with Exchange Online. Exchange On-Prem is also supported, okay? So the example here is Exchange Online, but you can use Exchange On-Premises as well. And with that in place, if I look at a screen grab here, this screen grab is actually from the OneTouchStyle portal where I configure this, and you'll see that we have Office 365 communicating with OneTouchStyle, OneTouchStyle communicating with my, let's call it a legacy group system endpoint, non-Teams native endpoint. So that interprets the inbound meeting invites, manipulates the invite into a format that the endpoint understands. And now on the screen of my endpoint, you'll see here that I've got a join button for a Microsoft Teams meeting. Now what that join button does, when I click that join button, all it's doing is automating the dialing of the string that exists in the Real Connect for Teams meeting invite. So earlier I talked about how when we deploy Real Connect for Teams, we end up with that additional bit of text at the bottom of the invite. That's what OneTouchStyle is looking for. So for this to work, the person that is creating the Teams meeting needs to have the OneTouchStyle text in their meeting invite. They send the meeting invite, Office 365 sends that to OneTouchStyle, OneTouchStyle sends it to the group after manipulating the text that exists in the meeting invite and turning it into something that the group system understands to put a join button on the screen. Okay, that is how OneTouchStyle works. So OneTouchStyle is used for your own internal endpoints that you want to join Microsoft Teams meetings, one button and click to join. And you can use it for Cisco or Polycom rooms. Okay, I've also used this with a Studio X50, one of the newer devices, not in Teams native mode, just as a Polycom stock standard, standards-based device. This also works. And I'm able to share via Miracast and AirPlay into a Microsoft Teams meeting with one button click to join into the Teams meeting. Okay, so it's not just for legacy devices; it can also be useful for new devices. Okay. So when to use Cloud Video Interop? You may have an existing investment in standards-based endpoints that you need to sweat over time, or it's cost and complexity to actually switch those rooms out for Microsoft Teams rooms. You may want to deploy Teams as meetings before you're ready to swap out your standards-based meeting room endpoints. This is a really common scenario. Okay, we have a company that's looking to move 5,000 users to Microsoft Teams, particularly through COVID at the moment. Right, we've got a lot of people working remotely from home. They're not using the meeting rooms. Okay, but they're using Teams meetings really heavily. So a lot of organisations, they're not ready to rip out all the equipment in their meeting rooms. It's not native Microsoft Teams room systems or Surface Hubs or something like that. But they want to make sure that those rooms can join Teams meetings, particularly when people start to come back into the office. So Cloud Video Interop can help in that scenario, particularly coupled with OneTouchStyle, because then I can also push the button to the screen of those rooms within the organisation. I might be using Teams as a meeting platform, but I still have an outbound dialing requirement into standards-based SIP or H323 conferences. Okay, so this is another common scenario that we come across. So one thing that I can't do from a Surface Hub or a Microsoft Teams room system panel is dial out to a standards-based H323 call. Okay, I can technically dial out to standards-based SIP, and I'm going to show you some things in a sec, but I guess a rule of thumb is that I can't dial out H323. So I might have some scenarios in my organisation where I must be able to dial out H323. Okay, there might be other companies that we interface with, a parent company or something like that, and they are sending the invites and they're controlling the meeting experience. Right, so I don't have any say in it. I must be able to join external H323 calls, right, or bridges. So one scenario I've seen some organisations use is they've actually swapped out all their meeting rooms for Microsoft Teams room across Australia, in my case, but they keep one room per state, which is actually a standards-based room using a Polycom endpoint that's using Cloud Video Interop and OneTouchStyle, so that endpoint can still join Teams meetings with one click, but those rooms also have some additional flexibility in that they can dial out to somebody else's H323 meeting. Okay, so those rooms are kind of special rooms. Often those meetings are exec meetings or C-level meetings. One of my customers was talking to TV stations, right, which is why they needed this capability. So that's another scenario. It's not all or nothing. You could have 95% Microsoft Teams rooms and 5% standards-based rooms to meet those requirements, and use Cloud Video Interop and OneTouchStyle to add value to those rooms to make sure they can join Teams meetings. Okay. So the other one is if I'm migrating from Skype for Business to Teams within my organisation, and in the past I've utilised Polycom's group or trio series endpoints for Skype for Business meetings in the past. Another really common scenario, right? There wasn't a lot of choice in endpoints with Link and Skype for Business, and through the third-party interoperability program, Microsoft partnered with companies like Polycom to allow their devices to natively register to Skype for Business. The Polycom group was one of these devices. The Polycom Trio, with the audio video, so with what they call the Visual Plus box and the C930 camera that you see there, wasn't strictly speaking certified, as far as I'm aware, to be used with Link or Skype for Business, but it worked, and it solved a pretty big use case, which was I need a cheaper endpoint for a room. And this is before Skype Room System, before Microsoft Teams Room. Okay, so you might have these in your environment and you're ready to move everyone from Skype Business to Teams, but again, you're not ready to rip out these rooms and replace them with Microsoft Teams rooms or Surface Hubs. So again, Cloud Video Interop OneTouchStyle allows you to keep using these rooms with Skype for Business, allows them to join Teams meetings via a cloud-based platform, which is Cloud Video Interop. And then I've kind of broken the chicken or the egg problem of when do I replace the rooms during this migration from Skype for Business to Teams. It's a short-term solution in order to not hold up the rest of your Microsoft Teams migration. So I mentioned some of these before, some of the limitations. So one limitation, Cloud Video Interop does not support ad hoc dialing from a standards-based endpoint into a Teams meeting or endpoint. Scheduled meetings only. So when I use Cloud Video Interop, I can't walk into that Cisco room or that other standards-based room and dial, Damien on Teams. That scenario is not supported. The endpoint is not really aware of Teams. It's only supported to support one direction scheduled meeting into the Microsoft Teams meeting. So it's got to be a scheduled meeting, not an ad hoc meeting. CVI enables standards-based endpoints to dial into Microsoft Teams meetings. It does not enable Teams to dial out to a standards-based room, which we just covered off on. Okay. So the last section here, I'm going to talk a little bit about direct guest join. So up until this point, as far as interop goes, what we've talked about is Cloud Video Interop. And Cloud Video Interop allows a standards-based SIP or a standards-based HTTP endpoint to get into your Microsoft Teams meeting, regardless of whether it's your endpoint or a third party's company, one-way, standards-based into a Microsoft Teams meeting. But of course, as I started off talking about at the very beginning of this session, we're no longer in a world of just SIP and HTTP. We have Zoom, we have Webex, we have GoToMeeting, we've got any number of platforms that exist that are all being developed in the cloud outside of these standards. And today, the big ones, the three big ones, Teams, Webex, Zoom, right? They're pretty big. None of those kind of use a standard per se. They've all got their own way of doing things. So now that we're kind of moving to this world where we have kind of software-based solutions and solutions that are built out of the cloud, how do we do interop with those environments? And this is where direct guest join comes in. And you'll see here that it's coming soon-ish. We've been waiting for this for some time. But in a nutshell, what it is, it gives me the ability to join a Webex or a Zoom meeting from a Microsoft Teams room system and vice versa. So if I'm on a Webex device, I should be able to join a Teams meeting or a Zoom meeting. If I'm on a Zoom meeting device, I should be able to join a Teams meeting or a Webex meeting, okay? So the three parties are playing nicely, and the capability was announced at Microsoft Ignite last year, okay? And here's an example of what it may look like. I'll be able to send those meeting invites to my Microsoft Teams room, and I'll have a little Webex or a little Zoom logo. I can walk into that room and hit join and join that meeting. Now, one thing to point out about how this actually works is that it's not using an interop service to make this work. What it's actually doing is when I hit that join button, it's joining, well, apparently, I'll preface this, I haven't seen this in action just yet. When I hit that join button, it's actually using a local Webex or a local Zoom guest join client to essentially take over the room system, and I get the native Webex or the native Zoom meeting experience in a Microsoft Teams room. And when I finish the meeting, then it goes back to Microsoft Teams room, and vice versa for the other platforms as well. So it's not just Teams that will have this, Webex and Zoom will have this capability for the other two platforms as well. So here you'll see an example where I walk into the room, I hit a Webex join, and you'll notice after hitting Webex join, that's a Webex experience on the screen. right? It no longer looks like a Microsoft Teams room system. And to be honest, I think this approach is probably the smartest approach. In a world where we don't have a one-to-one mapping like we used to, SIP and HTTP3 to do interop between, it's pretty difficult to have a cloud-based interop provider that can actually do the interop between all of these disparate solutions. What makes more sense is that we have this concept of a direct guest join application that lives on a, my software codec these days, all running Windows 10. That gives me the ability to have the native experience on that third-party platform from my device. Okay, so really looking forward to this. It's going to solve a lot of problems. It's pretty common for most organizations to have either some pockets of another meeting provider, not just Teams, but also they might want to join meetings from other organizations, right? We don't always have control of the meeting platform that we're joining. So just as a bit of an aside, can I join a Zoom or Webex meeting from Teams today? Kind of, but not the greatest end user experience, and there's prerequisites. So there's some configuration required at the far end. So in this example, Zoom must allow Sky for Business client to join a Zoom meeting, right? That's something out of the control of our end. It's something the far end has to support. You have to be in Teams only mode for this to work. And if that is all true, I can technically dial this link.zoom.us URI to get into a Zoom meeting. I won't go into this in too much detail. Tom over at Tom Talks has done a great little blog on this capability, but it does work. So this does actually allow me to get into a Zoom meeting from a Microsoft Teams client, assuming certain prerequisites have been met. Okay? So if you weren't aware of that, that's something that might be useful in the short term. From a meeting room device itself, we can do a similar thing. So if in this example, this is a Microsoft Teams room panel, it's in native Microsoft Teams default mode. I click on new meeting, and then down the bottom, you'll notice there's this enter a URL button. If I click that button, you'll notice the color over here on the left changed from kind of Teams blurple to kind of more Skypey blue. And that's because it's actually flipped across to the Sky for Business mode on the device. And once I do that, I can actually enter that key in as well, or enter that URI in. And similar to what I showed you before from the Teams client, I can actually get into a Zoom meeting from a Teams meeting room device, even before we have, direct guest join. Again, user experience isn't great though. This workflow is not great unless you know that you can do this and you're a bit more technical. Maybe it's not going to be something that your end users are going to want to do. So I'm a big fan of the one button click to join a workflow that we're working towards with direct guest join. But in case you're interested, it is there and you can do it. Okay, so in summary, video interop for Microsoft Teams. So give native VC endpoints will give you the best experience in Microsoft Teams, hands down. So if I'm doing meetings on Microsoft Teams room, I get the benefits of proximity join and front of room whiteboarding and content capture cameras and a whole bunch of other things that I'm not going to get if I'm using a non-Teams native device through a video interop service. If I need that flexibility though, Cloud Video Interop is there to save the day. This helps to support migration of Teams endpoints over time. Okay, removes that pain point of joining Teams meetings from existing legacy room infrastructure until I'm ready to move those rooms across to Microsoft Teams native room systems as well. Supports external standards-based Teams meeting join, right? That might be useful enough for you to get Cloud Video Interop. You may still need some standards-based endpoints for outbound HTTP3 or SIP dialing to meet your business requirements. And direct guest join for Webex Zoom meetings is still on the way. So I think this was initially going to be a little bit closer, but due to some of Zoom's security issues that they were working through, they did have a change freeze for I think 90 days. I think some of that's been held up, and that's impacting the whole process. So not saying that's the only reason why we haven't seen it yet, but I'd say that probably didn't help. So that's where that's at. And with that, I'm going to hand over for questions. Let's just have a look at the published list. Okay, so Before I do that, Peter, do we do this here or do we move across to the breakout zone, or what's the etiquette here, Peter?
We do this here actually, Damien. So we have a couple of questions here, and I think the first one you may have already answered, which was, can I join a Webex or Zoom meeting, e.g., external organized? I think you might have touched on that a bit, but
yeah. So today there's some caveats, but yes, you can do it, assuming you know on what they've got interop wise on their end, right? So we're not always in control of what the customer has. So, for example, the free Zoom, accounts don't have, you know, link interop gateways and things like that, which is what it was relying on to do that. So today from Teams, I can't join anyone's Webex or Zoom meeting. What this capability is really going to add is really when we're talking about the meeting room technology, so Microsoft Teams room system panels, and eventually Surface Hub, I would say as well, where they can join any Webex or Zoom meeting from the panel without having to do anything clever or any workarounds or anything like that. I can basically join natively, you know, for lack of a better term, as a guest.
cool. And the other question we have is from Dan, and he's asking, how's Zoom meeting data encryption? We've heard a lot about security issues with using Zoom.
Yeah, look, and rather than go into it, because I could be here for hours, what I'm going to do, Dan, I'm just going to reply with a link to a blog that I did a few months ago, which is actually on Zoom, Teams, and the elephant in the meeting room, is the title of that blog. Where I actually talk a little bit about some of Zoom's security woes and some of the issues that they were running into, and touch on encryption and Zoom's, I guess, definition of encryption and how it differed somewhat from what it probably should have been. So, and I think, to be fair to Zoom, I think they are aware of their problems, and they are investing a lot of time and money now into trying to make sure that they've got a rock solid service. But they've got a bit of work to do to catch up. You know, a lot of what they were doing was focused purely on getting features to market as quickly as possible to meet end users' needs, as opposed to, we want to get these features out, but first we need to make sure it fits into a security compliant framework, right? Which is Microsoft's approach, right? I know people get really upset a lot of the time for how long it takes some features for Microsoft to release. So even something as simple as 3x3 video that people were waiting for Teams for some time, there's a lot of architecture that goes into that to make sure that can actually stay secure, to make sure things that can actually scale to handle that while still keeping all the video feeds secure, those types of things. Even background images in Teams. I actually had that for about 6 months. The reason it took so long for it to get to the general release was Microsoft was making sure that they actually had the PowerShell control mechanism on the back end ready to go, so that organizations could control that feature, right? So the feature was there, but we needed to make sure it was secure and whatnot. So I've kind of gone off on a tangent a little bit, but I talk about a lot of this stuff in that blog. So please check that out. If you can see that in the published Q&A section there. I'm happy to talk more about it in the post-session networking as well, if you want to hang around.
Awesome, thank you, Damien. And we've got one last one from an anonymous audience member who's asking, how long has CVI got left until it becomes obsolete, do you think?
Yeah, look, I think it will be around for quite definitely short to medium term, probably long term. There's still a hell of a lot of organizations out there that use standards-based, whether it be SIP or HTTP3, to do their video conferencing. And it's not just in you know, in the big countries that we think of, but in some of the more developing countries as well, where it's still used quite heavily. I expect it to be around definitely for the short to medium term. We're obviously moving towards more cloud-based solutions that aren't based on either of those protocols, and we're moving more towards interop happening at the device level, like I showed you with direct guest join and things like that. But I think it's a pretty safe bet that for some time to come, cloud video interop will have a place in order to meet those additional standards-based interop requirements.
Okay, thanks, Damien. So that's all the questions, and that's all the time we have for this session. So if you would like to talk some more with Damien following the session, you'll be able to find him in the session breakout area. So please take a look in the Q&A for the link to join that meeting. And thank you all very much for watching.
Thank you, everybody, and thanks, Peter. See you later.
Thank you.